It's sort of an adventure doing this because I didn't study computer science myself. It's all hearsay on my part, but hopefully we'll have fun. And the plan is to talk first of all about what is money, which is quite a provocative question. Then I'll talk about a few topics in computer science, and while I'm at it, I will tell you what's a primitive blockchain, a word you've heard a lot, and very few people have defined that. And then the second part, I'll tell you about Bitcoin, about my own work, which is about who pays for Bitcoin, essentially. Who pays to maintain that system. And before I continue, yeah, I'm not sure how to control this. You're right, I asked you to be loud. This is the problem? That's a clear physical interference. Okay. Better now? Start talking, okay. Okay, so the second part will be about Bitcoin, about my own work, which is done with Jacob Leshner and Siamak Moalemi from Siamak is from Colombia, Jacob now is at Chicago, and we talk about who pays for the system. At any rate, to motivate this, we've got to talk about what is money. But before we talk about what is money, wait, I got to turn this on. Well, there's a switch here. Right. Okay, let's say a few words about Bitcoin because that's why you're here. So Bitcoin itself has spawned like 2,000 altcoins. The code for Bitcoin itself is open code, so you can copy it, write your name on it, and there you go, you have another coin. And last week we were told that Facebook is doing something that is inspired by Bitcoin, so there's more and more of those. And here's a link in case you get hold of the slides. You can see a list of them and how much they're worth and how much they're traded. Now basically, I'm going to repeat that later, but when you think about money, there are two forms of money. One form is the cash in your pocket, which is possession, is ownership, and that's the end of it. Nobody asks where it came from, and nobody can find out where it came from. The other form is a ledger, the money in your bank, which is somebody maintains a list and it's a history, and by law the two should be worth the same. So what is Bitcoin itself? I would like to use the word physical entity because it's not physical, it's virtual. So you cannot really get hold of physically of like you can get hold of this ID. But Bitcoin itself is really a list of messages, which is public, it's anonymous, it's ordered and time-stamped, it's stored on multiple computers, so it's important that they have the same information. That's the next step, that's the consensus. The computers have to agree on the content. And because it's money and money gets used, history should be fixed, but future should be modifiable. So there's new messages that after some vetting they get into the list. Vetting is done again by this elusive consensus. It's authenticated. When you talk about money, there must be some ownership, some form of ownership, and only owners can transfer. So that's done by public key cryptography. The history is immutable. You cannot change the history. Those are roughly the main attributes of Bitcoin, about 10 of them. And when you think about them, I know this is a lot to digest right now, but in 3 hours time or 3.5 hours time, you may understand this all, hopefully. There are tensions here. It's both public and anonymous. The same list has multiple servers, and the list itself changes. Think about how difficult it is to do that. There's consensus, and then you wonder who are the voters of consent. How do you generate consensus in such a wild environment? What's the consensus mechanism? What's the purpose of message? I mentioned messages are vetted, so there are legitimate messages, there are illegitimate messages. Somebody has to decide which is which. What's the purpose of that? How is it done? Who has to approve and accept the vetting, and what's the relation? And all this, you stop here and say, wait a second. What has this got to do with money? So I try to provoke you into touching on these issues. So when you want to talk about whether Bitcoin is money or not, you want to talk about characteristics of money, and it's easier to talk about the evolution of money. And what you're about to see is my own I shouldn't attribute this to myself as a narrative, but I should absolve anybody else who wrote about money from this narrative, because that's the one I put together from various sources, and I'm not sure it's all in the consensus of the historians of money, but it gives a narrative, an idea of what is money. That's my goal. So I'll go over the following steps: barter, commodity money, paper money, banks, fiat money, and central banks, in this order. They're all related. So money has to do with exchange, and exchange is really a human phenomenon, as Adam Smith said. And I just could not resist but put up this quote: nobody ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another with another dog. So if you don't want to be dogs, you want to do exchange, and you do want to do exchange, it's almost necessary to have money. And Noble, who is not here, had a beautiful illustration with the three periods, who gets what when, and the need for a way to have you need a medium of exchange, and you need a store of value, otherwise it doesn't work. So imagine you want to exchange goods and services for other goods and services, and the question immediately comes up: who gives whom more, and what to do with the imbalance. So think about a merchant. He has one commodity in abundance, tries to receive what he needs from other goods. What's he going to do? He's going to carry a price table. Those price tables gets wild really quickly. You want, how many do you have? 20 goods? 20 goods is 20 by 19 divided by 2. So it would help to have a unit of account. And you have to identify or link each good to the same unit of account in terms of how much it is worth. So that's already the first step, the first intellectual step toward the emergence of money, or a first intellectual step. Then if you have a unit of account of a single good, you can imagine that all commerce is done into and out of that good. And that good quickly becomes the medium of exchange. And if you believe that it remains a medium of exchange, then it has to be a store of value, which are really the three attributes we often cite for money, which is unit of account, a medium of exchange, and a store of value. So when you live in barter, maybe one good becomes traded a lot, and you ask, is it durable? Can it be carried easily? Is it easily verifiable? And if it is, maybe that's a candidate for money. And here are examples: gold, salt, cigarettes. Anybody heard about cigarettes as money here? What? In jail. It was in prisoners of war camp in Germany that, and actually it's interesting, the story I read was that it was initiated by the non-smokers. They were getting rations. It was the non-smokers who were happy to get rid of them for something better in their eyes. So these are examples of money that tell you money is not.
That's your merchant has excess of a good.
Right. Well,
Right.
they were not even. They were. It was the helicopter drop of a good.
Right. But then some people ended up with excess.
Right. They were not smokers. Yeah. So there's some exceptional good that becomes that has the highest probability of trade, and that itself is self-sustaining, and it will become a unit of account, becomes a store of value. Now, to become a store of value, and that's really critical, the receivers of this good have to believe that it will be useful the next day, or the next week, or the next year. Meaning they can turn around and pass it on to somebody else in exchange for something better in their eyes. So it has to, so that's an attribute of a store of value. So the special good, you want it to be durable, portable, verifiable, maybe a few other things that I didn't think about. And you can ask whether a medium of exchange cannot be a carrier of value, and the opposite question. And notice the key here. The key is that it is accepted, as Jose called it a bubble. It is accepted, and the giver receives something of value in exchange because the receiver thinks he can turn around and pass it on to somebody else in exchange for something of value to him. So money itself, by itself, has no intrinsic value. It doesn't have to have any intrinsic value. It has to have, it's a social convention that supports it being used as a medium of exchange. Now, there are limitations to the construct I've given. Limited quantity of the privilege restricts trade. Unlimited quantity undermines credibility. There's a question of caring and exchanging this. So you can think about an institution that sets up the following scheme. They will store this unusual good in their wallets, in their vaults rather than wallets, and write IOUs instead. The IOUs are easier to carry around, easier to verify. But at this point, which is maybe an improvement, but at this point, trust and social convention become more important because then you have to respect this unusual, these IOUs that they really come from this institution, and you can turn to the institution and collect on that good when you want to. By the way, I'm not sure whether this still exists in Israel. You can tell me, Sergio, but when I grew up, it was not unusual for people to write checks. So I would write a check to Sergio, who's sitting here. He would accept the check and give me whatever I wanted for that. And then he himself would not cash the check, but rather endorse it and pass it on to Eric. Eric would accept that, not because he knows who I am. By now, Eric doesn't know who I am, because he trusts Sergio to pass on a good check. So that's, if you will, a form of money.
Still exists.
What?
Still exists. You ask me
If people still do that, okay.
Tax avoidance.
Yes, it's a media tax avoidance.
Okay. So the institutions that store the commodity money and issue the IOUs, and those institutions, the next step is they say to themselves, wait a second, the in-traffic and out-traffic are more or less the same. So I can issue more IOUs than I really have stuff in my wallet, in my vault. And that's where fractional reserves come into being. So, and that's even better until it's not better. Then you learn about financial crisis if this doesn't work. And now, fiat money, the IOUs don't need to represent claims on the actual privileged commodity. The IOUs can be valuable because the expectation of the future acceptability. And indeed, in 1971, the US delinked the US dollar from the gold backing, a pre-specified party, and now all money, certainly the US dollar, is fiat money. There's nothing, the US government has absolutely no obligation whatsoever if I find its office and put a bill of $1 or $10 in front of the US government employee and tell him, give him something in exchange. He owes me nothing. So all money is fiat money. There's no backing of the US dollar or the British pound or whatever. So currency by now replaces barrier. It's a medium of exchange, store of value if you didn't account, and yet nothing really supports it, except people's beliefs. Now, I should qualify what I said, because the US government and other governments will say you can pay taxes only in national currency. So that already is a use case. And moreover, the government will say we'll pay our employees and our suppliers only in our national currency. But private citizens, if they want, they could contract away from it. And
I don't think you can do it in the United States, right? Eric may know about that. There's something called the gold clause deal, right?
Gold clause?
Yeah. When the United States delinked, not this time, when Franklin Roosevelt changed the value, immediately legal for people to have contracts with gold. And
I know, I can tell you just that I was about to say, and Sergio again can support that, in the early 80s, there was huge inflation in this country, and contracts, especially rental contracts, were denominated in US dollars.
So many countries you can do that. So
Well, you come from Brazil, so I'm sure Brazil has these episodes
in
too.
Brazil we did the same, but I'm talking about the US.
Okay. So, okay, then we have a central bank, and okay, let's, for the sake of time, what I want to do is basically impress on you that, first of all, the currency itself has a fragile nature to it, and two, its support by government is also fragile and not obvious. And now I want to give you a quote of Mervyn King. Now, Mervyn King of 1999, an article he wrote titled Challenges for Monetary Policy New and Old. So Mervyn King was a distinguished professor. He's now again a distinguished professor, mostly of monetary economics. In 1999, he was the deputy governor of the Bank of England. A few years later, he became the governor. So he's from the heart of the establishment. And here's what he entertains in 1999. He says, electronic transactions in real time hold out the possibility that finance settlements could be carried out by private sector without the need for clearing by the central bank. Without such role in settlements, central banks in the present form would no longer exist, nor would money. So keep in mind that actually just keeping ledgers of transactions and who owes whom more can eliminate central banks as we know them. And that's from the heart of the establishment. However, then later on he entertains this possibility and concludes that trust is important. And then, I'm not sure that he endorses what I'm about to show you, but certainly he cites that. He cites a quote of, how do you pronounce his name, Bajot? The one who wrote about crisis? Badgett. Okay. And here's the quote. Nothing would persuade the English people to abolish the Bank of England, and if some calamity swept it away, generations must elapse before at all the same trust would be placed in any other equivalent. So the key word that I want you to take in mind is trust. So the social convention is supported by trust. Remove the trust and the social convention collapses. And the question is, if you want to think about money, is where is trust placed and why? So, coming back to money, and keep that in mind because that's a thread that will go throughout this talk. So, there's two forms of money. I've said this already. One is issued by somebody. Ideally, it cannot be forged, owned by the bearer, no questions of origin asked. Ledger-based, it summarizes ownership history. And a bilateral transaction always involves a third party, the bank that keeps the books. So if I transfer money to Eric, if we are in the same bank, it's that same bank that does that. If we are in different banks, then the banks have to transfer money to each other, and then the central bank or the clearing corporation that takes care of that. Okay, so we've talked about monies and from commodity to fiat. I want to talk about cryptocurrency eventually. Here are the design ingredients, and I'm going to talk about those in somewhat different order. Encryption keys. I'll talk about traditional versus public and private key. In encryption here mostly for identity management. And we'll use that to authenticate the identity and verify the content of the message. We'll talk about blockchain. Talk about mining, which is a word in English, but which is used or abused in the context of Bitcoin. We'll talk about consensus. So these issues we need to cover before we go into, well, not this one. We'll cover them in this order: blockchain, encryption, consensus. That's the next thing on our agenda. By the way, feel free to interrupt. I mean, so far it's been only Jose and he's been supportive, so if you have other ideas, then feel free. So here's where we are. So here's Bob Schiller, May 2018. Practically no one outside of computer science departments can explain how cryptocurrencies work. And immediately jump to the psychology, and that mystery creates an aura of exclusivity, gives the new money glamour, and fills devotees with revolutionary zeal. So I hope to liberate you from this constraint. And I myself, I'm not a Bitcoin evangelist. I think it's very clever. I'm not sure what the future is. It's hard to predict the future, so you could learn from the other talks. And I certainly won't do that. But I think it's fun to study it. At any rate, given Bob's challenge, I think it's worth pondering how Bitcoin works, and that's what I want to do today, mostly. Now comes the challenge: how do I move to the next? No, it's all on purpose. Now I got to move to the next. Oh. No, that's the previous screen. Okay, that's not working very well.
You have to change the view. I'm not very good.
I want to move to the second one.
You want to go what?
To this, this you can close, because I'm not going to use it any longer. So let's actually go here, close it.
Go to another presentation, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to another presentation.
To this one.
Huh?
Close this one.
You want to close this one and
Yeah,
then?
close it completely. You can delete it, I don't care.
Okay.
Okay, now it's good.
It's good?
F5,
Except-
F5 or something. F5. You make it full screen.
F5?
F5.
Where's F5?
F5 is here. Well, this one doesn't have F5. It's not Control L.
Go to view, full
see.
screen.
So messy compared with Apple.
Huh? I don't know why you don't do Apple here, right? I think this close this.
No, can you move the cursor here? Move the cursor here.
Where you want? I don't use Apple, so
View. What is the full screen?
And I thought I was incompetent.
Not sure why.
Okay, now take the cursor here.
Yes, but we can't see anything, so.
And it's control A. Okay.
This is not really working.
This used to be F5, it could be full screen F5. But I guess it's no longer. So that's all my knowledge.
Why can't we see anything?
Now you make it worse and worse.
I mean, that's a security coming from all the Bitcoin. You got into a restricted area. Trying to explain Bitcoin.
Wait, now can we do this full screen, this thing?
I don't know how it's connected here.
No, don't.
Okay. We got it.
אוקיי. אני רוצה מצגת, את המצגת הזאת להראות.
כן,
ותסתכל.
That's what I said. Yes, but she comes with now.
המסך בכלל לא מראה את זה.
כן, כן. הוא לא מורה בגלל...
בגלל סרג'ו שנגע ביותר מדי כפתורים.
מישהו פה עשה... זה יהיה...
Something number 12.
אוקיי? אוקיי?
I don't know the number, it's 12. But the name of the screen, I think that's it. Huh? Yeah. I mean, just one.
אוקיי, מצוין. תודה רבה.
אוקיי, זה שווה.
ועוד מעט תהיה עוד בעיה כזאת, כי אני מחליף מצגת.
רגע, אתה באמצע או אתה מתחיל?
בבקשה?
זה מתחיל? אתה באמצע הרצאה או מההתחלה?
לא, אני באמצע.
אוקיי. זאת אומרת שיש הקלטה.
Okay. I want to talk about cryptographic hash functions, which are really the key component. And basically that's a mapping from any information into a string of characters or hash. Mapping has the following attributes. It's easy to compute. It's difficult, practically impossible, to take the image and go back to the origin. Just practically undoable. Any input is acceptable, no matter how big the file is. Any change in the string of information will cause a big change in the hash. So in a way it's anti-continuous, meaning you have two origins which are very close to each other, the hashes will be anywhere but near. And then it's difficult or practically impossible to find collision, which means two inputs that end up with the same output. Those are the attributes of a cryptographic hash function. Any question about this? That's really the workhorse of the whole edifice. It's essentially a one-way encryption which you cannot reverse. There's no key, there's no way to, unless you know the origin, you cannot really interpret the output. So if I wasn't fumbling over this, I would walk you through an example. Actually, let's try. Well, it's going to be risky to do it here, so maybe I should not. But if you, did they get hold of the slides in the end? Are the slides in the public domain afterwards?
Yes.
Okay, so you go to this website and you type in "my name is such and such." You get a string of characters that you cannot interpret. What's interesting about this is if you change slightly, say "my name is John," and then with an exclamation point or comma, or you misspell John from capital letter to small lowercase letter, you see the hash is completely different. And then, okay, let's think about something else. Suppose you can put an input, the 5 characters, this was meant for classroom presentation, so it's not going to happen here. You put in an input, and the question is the leading digit 0? Suppose it's the number, the hash is presented in a binary form. So about half turn out to have zeros, in the figure about half turn out to be ones. So the probability of getting a leading digit 0 is half. If you want to get leading 3 digits to be 0, then the probability is what? What's the probability of getting the leading 3 digit 0? What? It's less than half. How much is it? Now asking the students, quick. 1/8, half times half times half. So, and then I challenge the student to give them, I offer $10 for producing 10 zeros. I never lost my $10. So the takeaway is that it computes quickly, function appears random, but it's really pseudo-random in the sense that the same input will deliver the exact same output. And here are the probabilities, which in the end tell us that you can use this mechanism for lotteries with pre-specified odds. So if you want to conduct a lottery that would say that someone will win with probability 1/128, I require that 6 zeros to be the digit, and probability of winning that is 1/128. And we'll use that in Bitcoin. Any question? Simple. Okay, good. So again, that's a film. I'm not going to show it. Tells you how much. So if the output is 2 to the 256, if you want to have a feel for how big the number is, it's about 1.15 times 10 to the 77. So the space, the hash number space is huge. So even though it can map a huger space into it, it's huge. It can map anything into it. So it's a way to store any data, in particular passwords. Passwords are often stored as hashes, not the original passwords. And the password has a unique hash, easy to create, difficult to reverse, and you cannot really decipher that. Here's the application that's more relevant. Suppose you want to store a large data set on day 0 and retrieve it on day 1, and you want to ask the question, has it been tampered with? So here's data. I tell Eric, please keep it for me and give it back to me next week. I says, fine, I'll do this for you. And it's a big data, it's expensive to do. I keep the hash of the data. Next week comes by and Eric gives me the data back. How do I know he didn't tamper with this? Answer, I hash the second version of the data, and if the hashes are not identical, I know something happened in between. If the hashes are identical, I'm happy. So the hash is an ambiguous summary of the data, of the message. What? Oh, yes.
So here you're saying hashes compress the message. In the first thing you said hashes will decompress the message.
Expand.
Expand.
Yes, expand the message. So, I mean,
Okay, so hashes are mapping from any data into a fixed length string. That's the answer. The data can be 1 bit, 0, 1. We can start from here. The data can be the Bible, and the Bible again, and the Bible again, and the Bible again, and raised to some power. Hash function can handle that too.
So in the example of a big database that is bigger than the hash size, you cannot be sure that it has not been tampered, because there is a change of the database that will give you the same hash. That requires
But collision.
So you only know it with an extremely high probability, but you do not know it for sure.
I agree. Look, you can even think about the following. I told you that a particular hash I had in mind was 2 to the 256. So imagine that space times itself, that the space square, that already is not quite twice as large, but its power is large. So there are collisions there, but you cannot find, they are practically unfindable. It takes, you didn't see that film, what is 2 to the 256, how long it would take to do anything there. Okay? And in fact, I'll tell you something else, so you don't have too high a faith in cryptographic hash functions. I didn't tell you how it works. And frankly, I don't know, and ultimately, nobody knows. This has been experienced. There are some mathematical theorems at the edges of this, but there's no proof that a particular hash procedure is really unbreakable. And there's actually a history of hash functions that have been broken. And people expect that the hash function that's used for Bitcoin will also break one of these days. So that's about tampering. That's about commitment. Even the author himself cannot tamper with the data. Suppose I want to make commitment. Here's a lecture of mine or pattern of mine, and it's hashed. I cannot come tomorrow and manipulate this and then I'll have a different hash. So it's like putting data in an envelope, in a sealed visible envelope. I can prove I know the data by reproducing the hash, but I cannot tamper with the content. Yes?
Keeps the hash function. Somebody has, you have to have access to it, but somebody has to have the function itself.
It's an algorithm, it's not a function. It's not a table.
An algorithm, I understand, the algorithm.
NSA maybe.
Huh?
It's in the public domain, I don't know. The answer is I don't know.
The algorithm itself is hashed, so you can't change it.
Okay, but I would like to know who knows it.
I mean, you get to an infinite address here.
Yeah.
So we have to be sure that nobody changed the algorithm, yes? So you
You have
hash
to
it.
have access to the algorithm that's somewhere. Somebody would keep that algorithm. You shouldn't be able to have a key.
So probably the answer is that it's kept in many places, and in principle you can check whether the hashing result is the same if you run it on this website, that website, and so on. It's distributed so many places, because anybody can implement a function.
now these sort of distributed keys where I send you to
Okay, let me talk about another application, which is the puzzle. That's used in Bitcoin, but it's a good place to talk about it. You have content C. You have nonce. Nonce is a number that occupies a certain field, a series of numbers. And you want to find the hash of this indication. So there's one field for C, another field for X, and you hash both of them. And you call the puzzle solved if this H, the hash of this, has certain properties, such as a certain number of leading zeros. And you can think about doing this you can think about having a competition among all of us in the room. I'll give you content, I'll tell you find the nonce, which is a number that together with the content ends up with a hash with a sufficiently large leading number of zeros. Is this clear? This puzzle? Yeah. Yeah, I'm saying here's the competition. Here's content, and the content could even vary among us. Maybe each one writes his name. And I'm saying add to this a hash. Here's a field for, not a hash, a nonce, which is an arbitrary number. you hash them jointly, and I want the hash to have 50 zeros, leading zeros. So whether that happens or not depends on both, but the content is fixed. The content is each one of our namesake. But the x has to do it. So you don't like the first x, you have to find the second x and the third x and so on and so forth until somebody hits upon the right x. So we can have a puzzle or a competition for a puzzle like that. Any question about this? So this puzzle solving procedure is essential part of the mining, famous mining for Bitcoin. But that was a good place to introduce it. Any question? Okay, here's another critical point. Sergio, I'm not sure I trust you with this any longer. Because now I want the next one. And that's not what I had in mind. Well, yeah, maybe that's the safest thing to do. So, okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is essentially the invention of the blockchain. The problem that the inventors, whose names are Haber and Stonetta, they worked at Bellcore in the late 80s, early 90s. The invention itself came 90, 91, I think. And the challenge they posed to themselves was, how do you timestamp a digital record? Now the problem with that, the digital record is just a string of zeros and ones that is independent of the medium, and anybody can claim, I had that on January 1, 1980. There's nothing intrinsic to the medium. It's not like a piece of paper that you can have forensic evidence. Oh, this paper didn't exist in 1980. It existed no earlier than 1985. Okay.
Watch exactly what it does with representation.
בוא תלך לפה, אני רוצה, זה לא הבא, זה העניין. איך קוראים לזה? כן, זה, אני רוצה את זה. יהיה מצוין, עכשיו בוא נלך להתחלה. אבל אתה יכול לעשות את זה בצורה של מצגת. מצוין. אוקיי, מצוין, תודה רבה. מסתדר. Okay. So again, since we are motivated by Bitcoin, first of all, Bitcoin itself came to the world on Halloween Day, October 31st, 2007. It came in the form of white paper, authored by Satoshi Nakamoto, who is a pseudonym, we don't know who he is. And it had all of 9 pages. That started this revolution. The last page is the page of references. And of the references, these 3 are to page by Haber and Stonetta, who were concerned about how to timestamp a digital document. And this one, by the way, is a review of the same problem. So half the references were about timestamping, and that's about blockchain, really. They didn't call it a blockchain. Satoshi Nakamoto, the word blockchain does not appear in Satoshi Nakamoto's paper. What appears there is block, space, chain. There's 2 separate words in the English language. And I don't know who were the first ones to start using this term blockchain itself. So, this... Feller?
The reference number 8.
Yeah, that's, I agree. I was a student, I was in love with, I think it's
Marvelous.
not quite as marvelous as Bitcoin though, as inventions go. Okay, so that's to...
I think that's had more influence on Bitcoin. More cumulative influence.
Actually, I have a slide, not here, about how many words Bitcoin paper is, which is very thin, as opposed to other stuff that has been written on it, and there's plenty. Okay. So here are these 2 gentlemen. Stu Haber and Scott Stonetta. They still hang around New York area. They were young. We were all young. And if you will, this is the issue, in a way. These are two pictures of Nancy Pelosi. They come from a YouTube tapes. And she gave an interview someplace. And then some enemy of hers distorted the interview, made a slur, made it look like she was drunk. Now, ultimately, both these tapes, both these videos, are just strings of zeros and ones. That's all there is to it. Which is the original? Think about it. It's really impossible to decide. Just if I give you two strings of zeros and ones, how can you tell one preceded the other? Which is the original, which is the copy? It doesn't depend on the medium. And Jose will talk about art, and there's forensic evidence that one thing preceded the other, one thing happened at a particular time. But here, so this question that sounds trivial, how do you timestamp, is really a deep technical issue. So the idea is the following, and here's a blockchain for you. You concatenate, meaning you put in a, catenate is a chain, so you put it together. The hash of the previous record, no matter, you get started with the first one, that's not important. The date, the current record, or its hash. You hash the result of these three, and you publish it widely. So you have a chain, essentially, of the last record with the history summarized by a hash and timestamp, hashed, and that's the input to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So you have this chain, which is essentially a blockchain. And what happens if you change one input? The change in one input will affect the next hash, which is the input to the next block, which will affect the next hash, which will affect the next hash until it's detected the last hash. And you've seen the hashes in the public domain. You say, wait a second, the last hash has changed on me. That must mean that somebody tampered with one of the earlier records. So you can go back with the hash until you find the hash that remained the same, and you say, well, until this point, everything is kosher. From this point on, something happened. So that's how you timestamp.
At this point.
At this point.
The moment the hash.
The moment the hash.
The first time the hash is different, that's where it
Correct.
is tampered.
The first time the hash is different. And also because the timestamping, you can tell for a given block that it must have happened after its predecessor and before its subsequent one. So that's, if you will, that sort of removes the mystery from a blockchain. Once you recognize that, you can do a lot of other things. Any question? That's the important idea in the design of Bitcoin. Yes? Yeah, do you have a question?
Still, we must point out it's extremely high probability, but not sure. That's the main. Because the length is constant, so the length of the hash, of the new hash, includes the old hash, so you must have the size doesn't increase, which means you only get into this extremely high probability, but not for sure.
Yeah, Sergio is right about extremely high probability, but here we're talking about extremely high probability of 1 minus 10 to the minus 200. It's very, as I said, the assumption is that there are no collisions. But
There must be, no, collisions there must be.
But
because
practically-
the hash of the previous period and the hash today are the same length. So you take a bigger data set and map it to a smaller one, so there must be collisions.
you're right. I admit that. Yes.
Pretty much know it's the same thing when you make a modification.
Yeah, but you
That's
cannot
the hard
find how to
problem there.
change it. to
But
fit
Sergio,
that.
instead of giving me a hard time, I invite you for the rest of your life to find the collision.
I mean, I only made the point.
You're right.
The theoretical point.
Yes.
So I understood that if
Speak up, please.
you have a hash, you cannot get back the record just from the hash, right?
Sergio could with very low probability.
Nobody
Well,
can.
you can get it back with very low probability.
No, that's practically impossible,
But-
yes.
But suppose that you realize that you made a mistake in the records at some point, so you can never go back and change the records, right?
Well, it depends what you can change the record and announce to the world that, oops, I made a mistake and I'm changing the record, and thereby I'm changing all future hashes. You can say that. Then it depends on the legal regime, depends on the relevant.
Might have been intermediate.
So you'll change all this. You have to rehash everything. And you say, sorry, I made a mistake. I made a mistake. And it depends on the context whether this is acceptable or not. But you're right. There's an element of commitment. But that's important. Think again. Let's jump a few steps ahead. You think about transfer of money. You write me a check. You don't want the check. I write you a check. You don't want to be able to modify the check later. I write you $100 and cross out one of the zeros. You don't want that to happen. So when I write you something, you want the commitment that I'm committed to that amount. On the other hand, I write you a check of $100. I don't want you to be able to add another zero either. So this mechanism, with probability almost 1, guarantees that. Another question? So that's really the first step of demystifying Bitcoin, understanding what a blockchain is. By the way, what I'm saying here, or my interpretation, is controversial. Everything about Bitcoin is controversial. So technically what I've said is correct. I'm standing by that. But whether this should be called blockchain or not, not everybody will agree on that. So this is just a website. What Haber and Stonetta did, they left Bell Core and they set up a company called Surety. In that company, its business was to accept data and timestamp it. Essentially, they were implementing their own work. In fact, you do Google Scholar on them, on Haber and Stonetta, and what you see is a list of patents they wrote on their idea. And how is it published? How is it published widely? Here's the answer. They publish in the New York Times. This is Stu Haber himself, and they publish an ad in the New York Times with the most recent hash. And I'll show you something I did. I think January or February. We can find the date. So this is a page from the New York Times, and here's the hash. I'm not sure what those zones are, zone 2 and zone 3. And these are the hashes on February 5, 2019. So it happens, they say they contain fingerprints, they call these the hashes they call fingerprints of all digital records notarized by Surety between January 30th and February 5th. So if you have a record, you can hash it and through them and do that. They charge you some money. As a business, it failed, I understand, from both Stonetta and Haber. And they couldn't cite me one case where this was used for commercial purposes, but it exists. Another place we can find this is Financial Times, another hash type data storage. Now, the problem itself is the classic. How do you attest to an agreement? By having witnesses and durable record. That's what they essentially addressed. So notice this is actually common to the whole Bitcoin issue. And in a way I started when I talked about money, which is there are certain things we do and we've been doing for generations with certain instruments. And now we're in the digital age and we can do the same or other stuff, or we're also restricted. You saw the Nancy Pelosi 2 tapes. How do you know which one is first one, which one is second? That's a feature of the digital age that you cannot tell. In the old days, you look at 2 books, you can usually tell which one is first, which one is second. You look at the painting, experts can tell which one came first. So what's novel about blockchain is the durability of the record does not depend on the medium, but on the durability of the intrinsic to the data itself. So it's really what it depends on is that the hash function remains a hash function, it doesn't lose its edge. And notice something else, there's no central authority needs to be trusted, to be honest. Again, if the hash function, the function itself is in the public domain, and nobody can touch that, then the whole procedure I described is out in the wild. There's no trusted authority. You trust the algorithm. Yes?
It's about this hash function. Suppose, is it possible to, is this hash functions are deterministic in a sense, or can I introduce a new hash, saying this hash is stronger or better or something like that, and hash everything again, and then is it possible to do that, or?
Okay, one, as we speak, there are multiple hash functions. So which hash you want to use, that's a matter of context and convention.
But for something like Bitcoin, the hash function is fixed, right?
Yes.
This is
For-
one that was chosen at some point.
It was chosen by Satoshi Nakamoto. It was fixed.
Yeah.
In fact, to get a little bit ahead of myself, I wasn't going to touch on that. The hash function of Bitcoin lends itself to parallel computations, which in turn lends itself to inventing hardware that does the hashing, that chooses the nonce and computes the hash. And therefore, Bitcoin evolved in the direction of industry that invents and produces those computer chips essentially, and computes those things. That's why you see big players there, which was not part of the original design. They are competitors to Bitcoin. Like one, it's not Bitcoin Cash. Bitcoin is something else, I forgot the name, that by design chooses another hash functions that the designers think lend itself less to the production of computer chips, but rather it's more, you can use the regular CPU or graphic cards, and that's on purpose to adhere to Satoshi's original vision. So there are things like that. There's no unique hash function, but in any context you got to specify what's the hash function.
But there is no comparison of security between two hashes, right? They all claim.
I didn't say that. Well, they all claim, but there's you're really pushing me to the end of my knowledge. But one concern with blockchain is what happens if the hash function is undone. Somebody can reverse it or find collisions, then you have to replace it. What do you do with the old blockchain?
That's my original question.
Well, I talked about this with Stu Haber. He doesn't know either. He has some ideas, but it's really not a problem. Okay, then I just want to say a word, in case you see this term Merkle trees, about how you can scale this. The way I describe that is each record gets its own hash and feeds into the next record, but you can combine them into what's called Merkle trees. Merkle trees are setups where the data are here, in this order maybe. You hash each data, you hash the pairs, and you build a tree like that. And that's the one that gets into the chain. So again, if you tamper with this one, you tamper with this one, you tamper with this one, you tamper with that one. That's and it's easier to work that way if you have lots of records than to work them one by one. So if you ever see the term Merkle tree, that's more or less its role. And that's part of the original Bitcoin design. So I have too many of these. And basically the idea is it's easier to correct. Imagine you conclude that this top hash is bad. You compare it to this one, you check this one, you can check that one. This one turns out to be all right. Problem is with this one. This one is bad. You check these two. Turns out with this, so this one is bad. You go that's where the tampering happened. So, to get ahead of myself, but to warm you up to Bitcoin, the way the blockchain works in Bitcoin is here are transactions. Each one gets hashed. Each pair of hashes get hashed. And you build a Merkle tree, and that's the Merkle root. And the head of the block has the Merkle root of the data in the block, has the previous hash, has a timestamp, has a nonce, and you go there. This is early, this is late. And you point to the history. Any question about this structure?
I want to nonce, if somebody looks at the data in order to check, so he sees the hash, right? Does he see the nonce too, or?
This is everything.
He sees everything.
Now the next question is, how come you cannot take away somebody's nonce and use it for yourself?
Yeah.
That's the question. Because one of the transactions here is a transaction that says the reward, I'll talk about the reward, there's financial compensation here, goes to me. Me, not Jose. So the me is goes all the way here. It's included here. The nonce is appropriate only for this particular block, including the money going to me. If Jose is foolish enough and puts in this goes to Gur and copies this, you're welcome to do that. But if you say this goes to Jose, the transaction says this goes to Jose, the nonce will not be good enough. The nonce is no good. This is clever stuff, okay? It's astoundingly clever. And any other question? Yes.
I don't understand what is the validation.
We'll get to that. This is just because I touched on Merkle tree. I figured I just use that to illustrate what goes on as a
You don't have to talk about it. We talk about that.
as a warm up. This is it's a complex structure. In fact, as Scott Sonetta said to me, the miracle is not that it works well. The miracle is that it works at all. There was such a big gap in knowledge, and he writes a 9-page paper, and 2 months later he issues the code with mistakes, and things starts working. It's really remarkable.
And
Yeah.
one more. The nonce is what because I have this block and I will put it in the hash function, and by varying the nonce I have to match.
You have to match the constraint on the hash.
Okay.
The hash has sufficiently many zeros to qualify as a legitimate hash. That's the idea. Yes. Yes.
Can I, for instance, have a different blockchain where I do not put the transactions? I can sort of eliminate this data from the block and still have a blockchain? Is it possible to do it?
Some blocks are empty. Some blocks have no transaction in them, except the transaction says the money will go to the block creator.
I want the transaction to be at every block, but I don't want to broadcast the transaction. I want the transaction to be secret.
But you don't have to broadcast the block either. And there are attack schemes that entail that for a while you're silent.
Sorry,
Okay, you're really getting ahead of me. And although I wasn't planning on talking about attacks, but I may. If you ask me the question again. So that's an advertisement for another competitor of surety. If you want to, again, keep your records, then do that. I prepared this a few months ago, and I had this. It is Senate moves to set legal foundation for blockchain timestamps. So
Now there's Italy Senate.
it's a
Now
beautiful,
the
Jose.
Senate has done something.
It's a beautiful building. Italy cannot do anything except preserve the antiquities, and even that's in doubt. So, okay. Okay, the next. Okay. Now let's see if I can figure this out. Okay. So we've learned how to timestamp, and I claim that's a primitive form of a blockchain. If you understand that, then that's good. You've learned something about what is blockchain, so that's an accomplishment. Now, but beyond timestamping, let's talk about what's not in Haber and Stonetta. It's not there because that wasn't what they were issued, what they were concerned with. One, the censorship freedom. In their scheme, the provider, the one who maintains that blockchain, can censor, can say, Elchanan, I don't want your business. Go away. So the censorship ability is there. Something else. The content itself, who is the sender, whose record it is, what's in the record, they are completely oblivious to that. They don't care. Now that's, when you think about transferring money, you do want to make sure that the one who is transferring the money originally owns the money. You want to make sure that the transaction obeys accounting rule, namely you can spend not more than what you have. And as I said, they don't care. And in fact, the first thing you want to make sure of is that the identity of the transferor, they don't care either. So you pay us money, we'll be happy to publish your hash. So you want identity management somehow, in a trustless way, that's the goal. You want to ascertain ownership, and you want to rule out double spending, meaning, again, since these are digital records, there's nothing, well, the question, what's preventing people from saying, I have these $10, paying them to Sergio, and next day I pay the same $10 to Eric, next day I pay the same $10 to Elchanan. That's, with digital record, in principle, that's doable. And you need an obstacle to doing that. The provider can edit their record before they entering into the blockchain. And also something that happens with Bitcoin doesn't happen here, maintaining the records of multiple computers. In the case of Haber and Stonetta, they use publicity as a tool of non-discipline, of non-tampering. Any question about this? Okay. So the general issues with a centralized system are security. If you have a centralized manager, then there's a single point of failure. You capture him, you capture everything. They're monopolists against you. They're pricing power. There's the holder problem that came up in Noble's talk, I think, no? So many, you're the clients, you depend on them, it's costly to move away, we're charging you more. But also the flip side is that there's flexibility to change the environment because there's boss. I'm saying all this because, as you will see later, the boss in Bitcoin is no single individual, no single entity, but a protocol. A protocol is really, it's very difficult to change protocol. And that's in contrast with this. So the protocol is such that there's multiple servers. We'll talk about pricing power and hold up, but also you lose flexibility to change. It's very difficult. Any question? So I mentioned the protocol. Now, if you want to understand what the protocol is, think about the language. We all speak English right now, and I speak English to you because I expect you to understand English and respond. I could be speaking Hebrew, half of you maybe would understand, but that won't be as effective in this context. Now the language itself doesn't change. Oh, no, I shouldn't say that. Language changes, but slowly. And there's no individual who can change the language wholesale. So language is like a protocol. A protocol is like a language, which is, we all understand what it is, we all understand the rules, and we all use it. It's in equilibrium because we expect other people to use the same. That's key. And that's what runs Bitcoin as well. And when you think about this logic, independent participants follow the protocol because it's beneficial to follow it. When you expect other people to do it, that's really an economy sandbox. It's incentives in equilibrium. And that's how we got interested in that in the first place. So next, in the 20 minutes remaining, I'll try to cover two computer science topics: public-private key encryption and consensus. If not, we'll do it after. Now, consensus, so you appreciate the problem with the distributed system. Here's a quote of Leslie Lamport. Leslie Lamport is one of the giants of computer science. His main concern was actually distributed systems. He's a Turing medal winner. And here's what he said. He said, distributed system is one in which the failure of a computer you didn't even know existed can render your own computer unusable. So there's lots of computers, there's something there you have no idea exists, it fails, your own computer is not usable. Think about this, that's pretty wild. LaTeX, yes, although that built on the Knuth. Lampo did many things, and he never worked in academia, interestingly enough. Okay, let's talk about this. Public-private key management. How many of you have heard about public-private key cryptography? I'm not asking for the front row, I'm asking the back rows. How many of you raise your hands high? So a handful. Okay, so I'll try to talk about this a little bit. So normal encryption, you have the text, you encrypt it, you send it to the world, the ciphertext, and the interpreter, the decryptor, has the same key. The key must be kept secret, and he converts the encrypted text into the original text. So an example, suppose the key is to shift forward by 3 letters, so A becomes D, B becomes E, C becomes F, etc., and hello becomes whatever, however you want to pronounce that. And you decrypt by moving the letters back. A becomes X, B becomes Y, C becomes Z, D becomes A, etc. Now, if an enemy, a hostile force, knows the encryption key, he knows everything. That's a standard example of a encryption, of standard encryption. So the challenge here, that's again another skill of the encryption. There's a shared secret. There's a message. You encrypt the message with the message with a shared secret. It becomes the encrypted text that's sent in the public domain. Now the Bob, he knows the shared secret and he can use it to decrypt back into the message. The problem is, how do Alice and Bob share the secret if they're in different locations, different places? That's a challenge for the traditional encryption. That's another scheme describing it. Let's skip that. Okay, in the public key system, you have a message and you have a key source 1, and together you combine them into an encrypted message. You send it. The receiver, this is the enemy, he tries to figure this out, but you need the second key to interpret it. That's the key. And I'll say a few more words about that. So there are 2 keys. This guy, Bob, if you will, generated a pair of keys. The public key everybody knows. Alice takes the plain text, applies the public key, encrypts it. Bob, he's the only one who has the secret key. He's the only one who can decrypt it. So it's very different and very clever. Here's another way it works. So each one of them has secret key and public key. This is Bob, this is Alice. Alice uses Bob's public key to encrypt the message. She sends the encrypted message to Bob or to the world, doesn't matter, but only Bob can decrypt it. Any question about this? This is so abstract, there are no questions, it's obvious. The question, how do you do this? And I'm not going to talk about this. What? An example? Well, you go to this website and there's a demo. When you get the slides, you can find a demo. I won't give you an example of public key and private key, how they're generated, because that requires some number theory knowledge of prime numbers and their properties, and that's really beyond. So cryptography, however, is not only about encrypting plain text and decrypting it. That's the first application you think about, and that's not the one that's used here. In the context of cryptocurrencies, cryptography doesn't use the text encryption and decryption. It's used for other purposes, namely authentication. So here's a digital signature scheme that's used, say, to authorize money transfer. There are basically three algorithms. One is to generate the keys. You tell the key side, the bigger it is, the more secure the keys are, but also the slower the process is. You generate the keys. You have a message and you sign it with your secret key. So at this point, the question for the receiver to ask is whether you really signed that. And once you sign it, you cannot change this. So you're committed, if it's money transfer, you're committed to the amount being transferred. If it's $100, you cannot change it afterwards. And then there's a third algorithm which with your public key and the message and the signature, they ask, is this true that the person who signed this signed, if that person and that message, do they correspond to each other? Any question about these three algorithms? So what you want is that the valid signature verifies, and you want the signatures to be unforgeable. And that's really the power of the public-private key scheme. Again, I have a demo here. Now notice the message can be private or public. The message itself can be hashed. The recipient cannot change the message. The sender cannot change the message. He's committed to that message. So again, the check, the proverbial check I'm talking about, is unforgeable. And that's the application here. That when you want to send money, you say, I'm hereby stating that I'm transferring a certain amount of money to somebody. Once I say that, I cannot change that. You have a question, Sergio? Okay. Now, those public keys also serve as identities. Look, these whole elements are here put together, so there's no boss, there's no central authority. Usually when we think about identities, be they library cards, driver's license, passports, there's some authority that issues them, verifies that you're who you are, and you're entitled to this document, and you get the document. Here, through this public-private key system, there's a practically irrefutable association between the public key and the holder of the corresponding private key. And again, to go back to Sergio's comment originally, it's all in probability. There's no 100% certainty here, but there's as close as they come.
Who produces the private key?
You go to an algorithm. The algorithm is based on properties of prime numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And the algorithm is based on the idea. That's as far as I know, really. Once I spoke with one of the inventors, Adi Shamir, who was actually in my court in high school. I flew with him and he explained this to me. So for 5 minutes I thought I understood this. But the 5 minutes expired and I don't understand this any longer. So, but the idea is that I give you a huge number and ask you to find its what is it? Factors. It's a very difficult algorithm. But if I give you the factors, you can multiply. So this irreversibility is key here.
One direction is easy, the other is more difficult. No, that I know what I know about factorization, but I choose my own private key, and I enter the system.
Yes. The answer is yes. The answer is nobody else does, and you're the only one who knows it. Yes. You perform an algorithm that will choose two prime numbers, or some other stuff, and from that it will derive with a formula,
And you publish the product.
a procedure.
And you remember the original two numbers, and you publish publicly the product. You ask, how do you choose those two numbers, those two prime numbers? Is that the question? No. You send me a message. I thought the idea of this public-private thing was that you send me a message and I decrypt it with my private key.
But you've given him the public key first. First of all, you publish the public key.
Yeah.
You get dispersed. You publish the public key, and you say, anybody wants to talk to me, use the public key to encrypt. Anybody, not only Sergio, that's in the public domain. Anybody, I can do that, Sergio can do that, anybody can do that. You, the only possessor of the private key, is the only one who can decrypt the messages. I can see what Sergio is sending you. To me, it's gibberish. I cannot figure this out. You can figure this out because of the public key, the private key. The private key has to be paired with the public key. They're not arbitrary numbers. Is that?
Yeah,
It's like magic. That's as far as.
and Sergio doesn't know my private key.
No, he has no idea. He has no idea what your private key is. He uses the public key. So can I, so can Elhan, can anybody.
Can you give an example of this?
I can give a demo, not an analytic example. No, I cannot.
Please. I'll show you one line and you will understand. I guarantee.
Would give you whichever is the product, right?
I don't know. I don't think it's just the product. I think you take the product, you subtract, and one from it. There's a whole.
Okay, something like that. But let's suppose you just give you the product. But the equation problem is very hard. Finding the truth rate, that's already a good way of hiding your true numbers. Just multiplying it. It's very hard to track for prime numbers.
Put differently, let me say the following, and I may be putting my foot in my mouth now, but let me recall a conversation with Michael Rabin, your former colleague at Harvard. I think he explained that to me as follows. You take two prime numbers, the product defines a field. Subtract one, in a field, every member has its inverse, a single inverse. Subtract one, it's no longer a field in that respect. There's something missing here, and there are multiple numbers there that have multiple inverses. So the private key has to decide which is the relevant inverse. I think that may be in something of that, but look, I think really it's the blind leading the blind here, so I shouldn't. Yes?
At a deeper level, isn't it email and password is an example? I mean, I can send email is the public key, so I can send you email if I have the public key. But I require my password, which is the private key, to actually send it.
No, it's more complicated.
Okay, so let's continue.
Let's continue. So the important thing is that we've established a decentralized identity management system. In that decentralized identity management system, since every person can hold multiple pairs like that, URI can be Eric 1, Eric 2, Eric 3, Eric 5, with different pairs. You can once release one public key and then another time another public key. It's doable. It says simple encryption is not here. It's irrelevant to Bitcoin and most other cryptocurrencies. And the important thing to take away is it's an irrefutable association between the public and its private secret counterpart, and the multiple applications. So what do we have? We have hash functions, we have simple blockchain, we have message commitment and authentication. What we need, since the whole thing is built on a decentralized network, is a way to code it over a decentralized network. And that requires consensus among connected computers. Now, let me say, before we go into consensus, I try to do this in a few minutes, which is hard, but I don't know much about this, to be honest. You read Nakamoto's paper. I showed you the references. There were 3 or 4 to timestamping. There's none to consensus. And the question is, to what extent Nakamoto consensus and non-consensus mechanism in computer science, how they're related? It's not entirely clear. I've read articles about this. Look, he touches on this idea, he touches on that idea. It's not clear what he knew, what he invented when he wrote that. As far as the time stamping, he says outright, I'm copying from here. As far as consensus, we don't know. And the fact is he doesn't quote Lamport, doesn't quote the question of time synchronization. So we don't know what he knew. Okay, so let me what is this? I press sign in. Okay. הסתדרנו איכשהו. Okay. So what's the challenge here? You want to describe elements and challenges to a system that is decentralized, dynamic and synchronized. And all these properties will achieve consensus. I'll talk later about what is consensus itself. So the system requires that the components there talk to each other and somehow maintain consensus over what's the state of the world. In a case where communication can go down, some nodes can disappear or show up, and even malicious activity is possible. So it's pretty difficult. Here's two examples. Clock synchronization, Google Docs. And I want to illustrate how novel and difficult the problem is. Let's talk about clocks. So you want to use the clocks. I'm using this one for coordination, not to be between you and your lunch and myself and my lunch. So originally there was a sundial and mechanical clock. They're both local. It was only in 1840 that the Great Western Railway adopts London time, and it would go to Manchester and other towns, and then you need the same clock. When you think about this, which is the master clock? It's not. There's no obvious answer. You can declare a particular clock to be the master clock, and it travels back and forth, maybe. But even then, it can break down. It can be slow. It can be fast. How do you know it is slow or fast? What do you compare it to? So it's not an obvious question. And Google.
Offer by William Kentridge the history of how clocks, how the synchronization of clocks.
Okay, I had no idea. Interesting. And then here's another example, Google Docs. We all use Google Docs, and most of us do use Google Docs. And you got to manage the read and write permissions. Where are the documents copies? How do you synchronize the copies? Who is the one who's typing counts? If the 2 people, or 3 people, or 5 people type at the same time, which is the relevant one? And you want to be robust to disruptions, you want to be robust to computer failures, you want to be robust to hostile actions. So you can make a rule, it accepts typing only after 60 seconds after the person finishes typing. So here you use the clock, a common clock, to resolve conflicts. But for that you need a common clock. But if you don't have a common clock, that solution doesn't work. You got to get around that. I'll show the problem with absolute common clock. Here's, can you read this? People in the back, can you read this? So here are 3 computers, P, Q, and R, and there are events happening to each one of them. And they send messages reporting the events, so that's part of the state. Let's think about Q1 and Q4. As far as Mr. Q, Q1 preceded Q4. So Q4 in a way is an update. However, because of latency, Q1 appears at that point, and Q4 appears at that point in R. So now they reverse the order. Which one is the one that counts? There's no obvious answer. Suppose even they carry with them the time of origin, but that's the time of origin according to this clock, not according to that clock necessarily. So that's just to show you what?
But you know which one is earlier. It's timestamp, you know which one is earlier. And
Yeah, but
how
you don't
we
know.
which
But you
one
don't
is
know.
earlier?
But you don't know which clock is earlier. The problem gets complicated because how do you coordinate?
Assume a common timestamp.
No,
Common.
Right, there's no common clock. The point is,
You only need to know that Q4 comes after Q1. I don't care what time it came.
you're right in this case, but
In your example, I'm taking your example as it is.
you're right,
That you
Sergio.
can do.
You're right. You're right. But it gets more complicated, and I'm not going to go into that. I just want to use that to illustrate the problems. So distributed.
Always to compare P1 and Q1. That's the issue. Something that's done by two different
Within-
computers. Then even if they have timestamps,
Right.
they need comparable
You don't know which
clocks
is one.
in order for how to decide should I take P or Q. But on the same one, there is no issue.
You're right. So you want to centralize. So a distributed system is supposed to centralize one. Is where the state divides over multiple computers. Work together means they talk to each other to establish the correct state or the state. Here's the problem with the timestamping. Individual component can fail. And so within a distributed system, it's hard to establish consensus. The essential agreements of consensus are agreements of termination, meaning all non-faulty nodes decide on the same state. So you query them, they all give you the same answer. Termination is all non-faulty nodes, there's a process that decides what the state, all non-faulty nodes eventually decide on what it is. The process itself doesn't go forever. Now I should add there's a third condition, which is the state is not trivial. The state is not trivial. I'm surprised you didn't say that. We can always reach those things by saying the state is 1. If it's 0 and 1, we all agree on 1 forever, nothing to do. But that's not a particularly interesting and effective thing. So, in this particular case, the challenge is to have a ledger of balance of the transactions, and you want the identical copies to be maintained and updated by multiple computers. Possible challenges: some computers are faulty, nodes or communication links. Some nodes are malicious, and that comes under the headline Byzantine generals. Byzantine generals are pretty hostile. They try to collude. That's the Lamport term. They try to collude to undo the system. And I'll give you an example soon. So you can start thinking about this by making these assumptions. Identity of the node is known, there's nobody Byzantine, they're connected in a complete graph, no faulty nodes, they're synchronized, there's a global clock. You make these assumptions, the problem is easy. But real world problem is not easy. Here's the business in general. Suppose some of the nodes conspire to sabotage consensus. So here's one situation. The focus here is Lieutenant 1. There's a commander. He issues the order attack and to both his lieutenants. But this guy, he's a traitor. He said retreat. Now, from the perspective of Lieutenant 1, he doesn't know who is the right authority. Because that's one situation from his perspective. An alternative is this one. From the point of view of Lieutenant 1, these two are the same. He sees attack from the commander, he said retreat from this side. But the difference is that here, the commander is the traitor. He's the one who is issuing conflicting orders. Here it was the Lieutenant 2 who forged the commander's command. Here's the commander himself. The Lieutenant 2 is faithful. He just repeats what he's told. So that's the crisis. Lieutenant 1 doesn't know what to do. Indeed, the theorem is that if you have less than 1/3 traitors, the algorithm to resolve this. So you have 1/3 or more traitors, forget about this. They can screw you. That's the Lamport again. So, what did Nakamoto do? He ignored this history, essentially, of thinking about consensus. So let's introduce economic consensus. 5 minutes and I'm done. You can have lunch. He ignored that history. At least it seems that way. He introduced incentives. Then in his world, there's no fixed node set. Participants can come and go as they see fit. It's a slow system. It can be expensive if many people want to use it. There's no trust in anybody. It's all incentives based, and he has section 6 in his paper called the incentive that's devoted to that. There's no formal finality in the traditional consensus literature. It was when you reach a consensus, that's it, you settle down. Here, there's always a small probability of reversal, but the probability again, if you progress in time, the probability becomes a hard probability. Then the probability of reversal is like 10 to the minus 50. So non-constant components, incentives are crucial, probability-based consensus. And I want to read to you the concluding sentences of Nakamoto's paper. Network is robust in its unstructured simplicity. Nodes work all at once with little coordination because of incentives. So again, you see the beauty of economics. You have incentives. People don't need to talk to each other. They just do the right thing because they expect other people to do the right thing. They do not need to be identified. His messages are not routed to any particular place and only need to be delivered on the best of effort basis. Nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, accepting the proof. I'll talk about proof of work. That's a nonce finding. Chain is proof of what happened while they were gone. They vote their CPU power, expressing their acceptance of valid blocks by working on extending them. We'll talk about this. Any needed rules and incentives can be enforced with this consensus mechanism. That was my boldface. Interesting enough, the word consensus is just the next to last word in the paper, and that's the only time it appears. But that's really the heart of the matter. How do you establish consensus? We can go to lunch. Unless there are questions. No questions. Great.